April 1945, Bavaria. At a temporary American prisoner of war facility outside Straubing, roughly 1,100 captured German soldiers were being processed as the Third Army pushed through southern Germany. For nearly 2 weeks the camp had been routine. Then, on a Monday morning, the work details formed up for maintenance, sanitation, and perimeter cleanup, and men began refusing to move. Not everyone. That was what made it worse. The refusal appeared in clusters, delivered calmly with nearly the same explanation each time. Under the Geneva Convention, they said, American guards could not compel them to perform this labor. Private Horst Weiss, the German-speaking American interpreter, heard the pattern before anyone else could mistake it for ordinary defiance. The words were too consistent. The timing was too clean. This had been organized. There was no riot, no shouting, no rush at the wire. Just a legal argument spreading through a prisoner population that had discovered something unusually powerful in a camp run by rules. A rule they believed was on their side. Captain Robert Denning, the officer managing the facility, did the one thing that made the dispute more dangerous and more interesting. He did not bluff. Denning had legal training from before the war. When the prisoner representatives presented their position, he checked the convention instead of dismissing them. And what he found was not simple enough for a shouted order. The 1929 Prisoner of War Convention did restrict what kinds of labor captives could be forced to perform. Work directly connected to military operations was forbidden. Camp administration and maintenance were treated differently. Rank mattered too, especially for officers and non-commissioned officers. In other words, the prisoners had found a real part of the law. But they were trying to make it carry more weight than it could safely carry. Denning could see the ambiguity. He could also see the risk of guessing wrong. If he forced the issue and the prisoners were right, he could turn a maintenance dispute into a treaty violation. If he backed down and their reading was too broad, he could turn one organized refusal into the operating rule for the entire camp. So he wrote the situation up and sent it higher. The report moved through Third Army channels. Eventually, it reached General George S. Patton. According to the account, Patton read the summary and did not begin by arguing about legal theory. He asked a practical question. Were the prisoners who refused to work still receiving the same full ration issue? The answer was yes. That was the point he seized. Patton's instruction, as the account describes it, was not to beat the prisoners, threaten them with weapons, or withhold food from the camp as a group. Any ration restriction was to be applied individually to men refusing lawful work, kept within the limits of prisoner treatment rules, and explained clearly before it took effect. The distinction mattered. A collective food punishment would have raised an obvious treaty problem. An individual disciplinary consequence was a different question. And the convention itself was not as simple as the organizers had assumed. Article 27 allowed physically fit prisoners to be employed according to rank and ability, while giving special protection to officers and limiting what non-commissioned officers could be compelled to do. Article 31 barred work directly connected with war operations. Article 34 specifically contemplated work tied to the administration and maintenance of a camp. The law did not say in one clean sentence what either side wanted it to say. So Denning did not turn Patton's order into a speech. He turned it into a procedure. He wrote the terms down. Then he gave them to Weiss. Weiss stood in front of the former German NCOs who had helped organize the refusal and translated the instruction into German exactly as Denning had prepared it. No improvisation, no insult, no promise that the Americans would forget what had happened. Just the terms. When Weiss finished, the organizers did not answer immediately. They stepped aside and conferred for about 20 minutes. Years later, Weiss remembered the silence more clearly than any argument. From where he stood, he could not tell whether the men were reconsidering their position or reinforcing it. Then they returned. They were maintaining the refusal, so the individual ration restriction went into effect. That is where the story usually gets flattened into a simple line about hunger defeating principle. But that misses what made the confrontation work. The prisoners were not facing an arbitrary punishment announced in anger. They had been told the rule, the consequence, and the point at which the consequence would end. The Americans were not asking them to guess what would happen next, and Denning had deliberately avoided the one thing most likely to turn the camp into a larger crisis: force. The first cracks appeared by the evening of the second day. A few prisoners reported for work, then more. By the end of the third day, the organized refusal had effectively collapsed. By Thursday afternoon, the camp's work rotation was functioning again. No mass beating had broken the strike. No warning shots had been fired. No prisoner had to publicly recant the legal argument. Men simply began presenting themselves for assignment. That quiet return mattered because it gave both sides a way out. The prisoners did not have to perform a humiliating surrender ritual. The guards did not have to manufacture one. The camp only needed behavior to change, and it did. Denning filed his report at the end of the week. The source account says he emphasized what had not happened: no force, no escalation beyond the stated consequence, and a complete return to the normal work system. Patton received a short summary. There was no victory message, no ceremony. The administrative record treated the matter as resolved, but the legal question did not disappear just because the camp had gone back to work. A separate Third Army legal review, as described in the account, examined the dispute afterward. That review matters because the prisoner organizers had not invented their argument out of nothing. Their mistake was not that they had never opened the convention. It was that they had built a broad conclusion from a narrow reading. The treaty genuinely protected POWs from certain forms of compulsory labor. It also distinguished military operations from camp work, and it treated rank differently. A former German NCO reading one provision in isolation could believe he had found a shield that covered everyone. A lawyer reading the surrounding provisions would immediately start asking narrower questions. What kind of work? For whom? Under what rank? Connected to what military purpose? And what kind of discipline was being imposed? That was the gap Denning had recognized on Monday morning. He had enough legal knowledge to understand that a real rule can still be misapplied. He also had enough caution not to pretend certainty where he did not have it. Patton, by contrast, recognized the operational weakness in the camp's arrangement. The refusal had no immediate cost. Men who worked and men who refused were being treated alike in the one daily routine every prisoner could measure without reading a single legal article: meals. As long as the dispute remained costless, the organizers could continue testing their interpretation. Once a defined, individual consequence appeared, the legal theory had to survive contact with personal choice. That did not make every detail of the prisoner's legal position foolish. The NCO issue alone made the convention more complicated than a simple work or no work rule, and it did not make food an unlimited disciplinary weapon. The 1929 convention prohibited collective food punishment and set basic standards for prisoner rations. Rank, health, and the nature of the work all mattered. What the incident shows, if the account is taken on its own terms, is narrower. A camp commander faced an organized refusal built around a legal claim. He did not assume the prisoners were lying. He checked. When he could not resolve the issue confidently, he escalated it. The response that came back tried to change the incentive without turning the disagreement into violence. And when the dispute was later reviewed, the broad claim that all the camp work was protected from compulsion did not hold. Denning's later reflection, as described by the source, makes the same point from a lawyer's angle. Years after the war, he used the episode as an example of what happens when people read a legal rule without the surrounding structure that gives it meaning. That does not make the prisoners stupid. In fact, it makes the episode more credible as a conflict. Bauman's group had done enough homework to create uncertainty. Denning had enough training to recognize that uncertainty. Patton's intervention did not erase it with a slogan. It forced the camp to operate while the question was being resolved. That is an important distinction. A bad commander can turn uncertainty into violence because violence feels faster. A cautious commander can also make the opposite mistake and let uncertainty become paralysis, because no one wants to act until every word has been settled. Here, the camp used a third path. Define the consequence, keep it individual, explain it in the prisoner's own language, and leave a route back to compliance. The result was not a grand legal precedent. The source says the episode never became a major disciplinary case. It was filed as an administrative matter, and the later legal review was not turned into sweeping new guidance. In a war full of events measured in divisions, cities, and casualties, this one remained small. That was partly the point. The facility kept processing prisoners through the final weeks before Germany's surrender. The source says Denning encountered no second refusal of comparable importance. In May, as the war ended, the population moved through the normal transfer process toward longer-term holding facilities. There was no dramatic policy announcement attached to Straubing, and no celebrated doctrine built around it. Whatever the ration decision accomplished, its observable result was local. The work system restarted, the camp stayed orderly, and the dispute did not become a larger confrontation. There was one more layer. Among the 7 former NCOs identified in the account as organizers, the oldest was a former Feldwebel named Ernst Baumann. Baumann had apparently spent days reading a German-language copy of the convention that prisoners could consult. He was not improvising. He had found a provision about labor, discussed it with the other NCOs, and built a position around it. That is what made the refusal coordinated on Monday morning. But legal texts are often most dangerous when one sentence feels complete. Bauman had a piece of the rule. Denning understood there were more pieces, and the camp had to keep functioning while somebody figured out how they fit together. For 3 days, that gap between a provision and its application controlled the mood of more than 1,000 prisoners. Then the practical question caught up with the legal one. The refusal stopped paying, the routine resumed, and the entire confrontation remained what administrators prefer wars to contain more of, a problem that ended before it became an incident. On Thursday morning, Bauman and the other organizers reported with the work detail. No speech, no final argument, just their place in the line.